So yes, today I want to talk to you about a project that I'm working on in partnership with a number of organisations, including Wrexham Museum and the Clwyd Powys Archaeological Trust. So Roman rural settlement has been a topic of conversation, interest, investigation and analysis for generations, but perhaps the largest scale project to date has been that of the Rural Settlement of Roman Britain project, undertaken by the University of Reading and Cotswold Archaeology. It set out to collate information on rural settlement in Roman Britain, and here we can see their distribution of excavated late Iron Age and into sort of Romano-British period sites, rural sites. Taking published data, but mostly it aimed to bring together evidence from the increasing number of grey literature reports. So these are the results of commercial archaeological interventions since archaeology became a statutory consideration in the planning process in 1990. It's produced an enormous data set and attempted to characterise settlement throughout England and Wales. It's also highlighted avenues for future work. Their database is publicly accessible via the Archaeology's Data Service. I sound like I'm doing an advert for them, don't I? And their findings have been published in 3 volumes. And while there are, of course, some caveats that need considering when looking at distribution maps like this, do they reflect areas of development-led archaeology rather than genuine distributions of settlement? It's the large gaps that appear that are of interest to me. It's particularly this large gap that covers most of North East Wales and parts of the borders and into Cheshire. And this is the gap that I'd like to talk about today. So to set the scene spatially, this is the area we'll be discussing, North East Wales, specifically focusing around Wrexham County, but moving out from there into Cheshire and Flintshire. You've got obviously the sea to the north and the Wirral Peninsula, Cheshire obviously to the east and Shropshire to the southeast. And then the Conwy Valley and Gwynedd over to the west. As you can see, it's an area dominated by the uplands, the Clwydian range between the Vale of Clwyd and the coastal fringe especially. These large areas of open moorland, particularly to the southwest of St Asaph and to the south of the county of Wrexham, create quite a sort of an upland feel rather than the sort of the lowland swathes of agricultural fertile land that we see in southern and central England. Of course, we've got the River Dee running through Chester, forming the boundary between Cheshire and Wrexham and heading inland, sort of coming from Llangollen and Corwen. The River Clwyd also cuts through this upland environment, which runs from sort of Ruthin and Denbigh, St Asaph up to the coast at Rhyl. There are some very fine areas of agricultural land within this though, so particularly the Vale of Clwyd, and to some extent around Wrexham itself, although there are patches of quite heavy clay soils there, which are perhaps not quite as productive as other areas. And it's where this red kind of dot is, where this kind of project was born, in the area of Burton Green, just over the A483 from the village of Rossett. And our story begins in this area, in the heady pre-COVID world of autumn 2019, with the discovery of this object you can see on the screen. Found by the chap in military fatigues, also there in the image, a local metal detectorist, Rob Jones, responsible detecting, did the right thing. He identified that he'd come across something potentially interesting and important, contacted the Portable Antiquities Scheme's Find Liaison Officer based at Wrexham to let them know. Within about 20 minutes, staff from the museum were out on site, including my project partner, the then director of the museum, Steve Grenter. He's the one you can see there in the check shirt, removing the object from the ground. It weighs 63.2 kilos, hence why he looks like he's rather struggling to lift it. Now, what we have here is a Roman lead pig or ingot with a very interesting inscription on it. Lead pigs or ingots are known from North East Wales, and I'll talk a bit about that in a bit. But what makes this one exciting is the inscription on it. It's the typical trapezoidal shape, otherwise around 50 centimetres long. The rest of it is kind of all quite usual. And the reason the inscription is interesting is that it includes the name of the governor, Trebellius Maximus, and his legato Augusti, or title of imperial legate. As yet, this is the only inscription that bears his name to have been found in the UK. And knowledge of Trebellius's time in the province otherwise is entirely limited to Tacitus's accounts in the Agricola. The Boudiccan revolt of AD 60 had caused a significant destruction and was followed by an inevitable period of relative inactivity or consolidation, which ultimately led to the mutiny of the army and Trebellius's return to Rome in AD 69. The presence of his name, therefore, on a lead pig in an area way to the north of what was considered under significant Roman control at this point is surprising. It potentially points to previously unsuspected Roman activity in northeast Wales during the Neronian period. Much of the stuff that we have going on starts in the Flavian period. Other interesting piece of the inscription is the suggestion of where the lead might be coming from. The name Magul, or place Magul. Currently unknown. We're not aware of a site that that can be attested as Magul. And it could be one of a number of lead extraction and processing sites in northeast Wales. Chemical analysis has been done of the lead pig by the University of Liverpool, by Alan Williams and the team there, suggesting that the lead definitely comes from a local Flintshire source. I won't pretend to understand the science behind this graph, but hopefully you can see the lead pig as the rectangle in the middle, square in the middle, surrounded by the blue circles, which tell us that its isotopic signatures are in line with those from the Flintshire lead field, or lead ore. So obviously, Britain was invaded under the orders of Emperor Claudius in AD 43. In 5 years, the army had reached this part of the island, where Astorius Scapula campaigns against the Decii Angli in northeast Wales and possibly into Cheshire. And according to Tacitus, he gets almost in sight of the sea. In AD 60, we hear about Paulinus in Anglesey, where he leaves rapidly to quell the rebellion led by Boudicca. In the following years, this is where our guy Trebellius fits in. He's brought in to govern the province. But it's not until AD 74, around that time, that the legionary base is established on the doorstep at Chester, or Diva. From then on, the area continues to be dominated by military administration and activity, with very little signs of a civilian town or substantial civilian administrative centre, other than at Roxeter in Shropshire to the south. So the lead pig has begun to raise numerous questions about the chronological understanding of the activity in the area, the extent of mineral extraction and exploitation, but it also happened to coincide with an ongoing conversation I'd been having with Steve for a number of years about a site close to where the lead pig has emerged, about 2 kilometres away as the crow flies. So we saw this as an opportunity to put together the research project to investigate the landscape context of the pig find spot itself and start to look at wider evidence for Roman activity in this area. So what do we already know about this landscape in the Roman period? Military sites have been long identified, although some additional practice camps continue to be added to our current state of knowledge as they appear in crop marks, for example. We're part of Britannia's western frontier, if you'd like to call it that, connected via Chester up through Cheshire and Lancashire to the northern frontier in Cumbria, so sites like Ravenglass and Maryport. But beyond the military installations, the majority of known Roman sites in northeast Wales, as we can see on the left-hand map, relate to mineral extraction and industrial processing, or many are stray find spots or sites of late Roman coin hoards. The roads are fairly well known in and out of Diva itself, of Chester, with some routes across the coastal plateau being archaeologically well attested. We know that there, we found them in the ground. Yet some lines of roads heading south from Chester, especially from Heron Bridge to Freeth and onwards to sort of Bala and Brythdir and out to West Wales. These are postulated lines of main routeways. There are also likely more minor routeways and trackways across the landscape lying hidden from us. So there's one area of a sort of gap in our understanding and knowledge. The other thing is to note that no Roman towns are known from North Wales. The nearest is the Civitas capital, the sort of county town of the time, at Rossett. Therefore, it's always assumed that the majority of the population, if there was one, was living in the Vici, or the civil settlements associated with the military forts across mid and North Wales. Either that, or perhaps archaeologically ephemeral farmsteads, sort of roundhouse settlements that don't show up as crop marks, and they're harder to discern archaeologically. So many of these other sort of non-military, can we call them rural sites, can be seen here on the small purple dots. I apologise for the size of the dots on here. It's the only way I could download the image. This is from the Rural Settlement of Roman Britain project. These are the sites that they've identified as being what they term as rural sites. That's a bit of a misnomer because this includes pottery production sites, salt extraction and processing sites, tile industries, and other industrial sort of lead working, metal working sites. And what I'd like to do though is just take a whistle-stop tour through some of these known sites to provide a bit of a flavour of the type of settlement that we're dealing with. Obviously we have Chester. I don't need to go into huge amounts of detail about the fortress at Chester, but established around AD 74, although there is some indication that there might have been an earlier fort, but that is still very much up for debate. Very much dominant in the landscape of what was northeast Wales and now also much of northwest England, this kind of gateway to the empire out through the River Dee and of course the Irish Sea. But it's got its civilian population as well, that immediately outside the walls in the Canabai, but also in the sort of suburban areas of Heron Bridge, of Saltney, and Farmstead, more recently identified at Satan Camp on the MOD land there. To the south, directly associated with the Legion in Chester, is of course Holt. East of Wrexham, on the border with England, we've got the Fabrica or manufacturing site for the 20th Legion, so where all their tile and pottery would have been made. Recent geophysics at the site by the Holt Local History Society has identified possible domestic buildings associated with the kilns. So one would assume these is accommodation for the workers. It was also transferred into civilian ownership and sort of operational oversight later on in its kind of functioning history. And presumably their workforce would have had to have lived somewhere. More recently still, so this is hot off the press in the last couple of weeks, working with Clwyd Paris Archaeological Trust, we've done some geophysics of a site a few fields over, just to the west of the Devon Brook, where we've got a series of enclosures and structures, and some Roman metal detected finds are appearing, suggesting that we've got a continuation of some sort of settlement surrounding the tile works itself. There's suggestions on the geophysics and looking at the LiDAR imagery that this suggests westwards even further. What character it is, whether we could define it as rural or industrial or a combination of the two, remains to be debated or remains to be seen. And we're hoping to be able to do some field work in that site, in that field this summer. I mentioned about lead processing and extraction. The big sites that spring to mind are along the kind of the Dee estuary, Oakenholt and Flint. So processing minerals, very much lead and silver. So the great thing about the Flintshire lead is that it's got a very high silver content. So this is a site that looks like it's got direct oversight from the Legion at Chester. We've got evidence for quite a high status building or a villa, as it's been listed in the Roman Rural Settlement Project, Whether we can call it a villa or not, again, is perhaps a discussion that needs to be had. But it looks like it's the home or the base of the Procurator Metallorum, so the person responsible for oversight of all of this processing. The lead pigs from this site are marked usually with Deci Angli. We've got some in the Grosvenor Museum. We've even got lead pig from flint found in Rome as well. Most of these, though, date from the period of Vespasian at the earliest. Associated with all the industrial activity, we've also got a complex ribbon settlement. So a settlement that you can see highlighted in red on the area of the map that straddles the Roman road running along the coastline. We've got burials and lots of evidence for kind of daily activity around this site. Very similarly to sites like Freeth, potentially. On the other side, on the Flintshire-Wrexham border, now underneath a modern village, we've got lead extraction, timber buildings, again dating from around the reign of Vespasian onwards. Legio 20, so 20th Legion tiles. Prestatyn, silver and lead production, military association with 20th Legion tiles again. Settlement hinted at, the bathhouse that's been excavated and consolidated, very well worth a view if you're in the area. All kind of suggesting very sort of military hands-on activity, oversight, if not direct involvement. To the east, up towards Warrington, we've got Wilderspool, the walled town. No evidence of a military camp here, probably established as a mansio, so a bit like a Roman coaching inn, at the fording point of the river. So it develops as a customs town and port, but also emerges as an industrial centre, pottery production especially. A series of sites indicating a large industrial suburb was found to the south as well, much like the sort of ribbon developments we get at Heronbridge, but also at Flint and Oakenholt. So they're largely seen as industrial sites, even though they've been recorded as rural on the Roman Rural Settlement Project database. A site that could be identified as a combination of rural and industrial is known at Plas Coch. So this is much closer to the Rossett area where we began our story. So situated either side of the A483, the majority of it underneath a retail park, as you head sort of southwards from Chester towards Wrexham. Evidence for industrial activity, pottery production, but also evidence for the production and processing of agricultural surplus. So big corn drying kilns, extensive field boundaries and field systems. Civilian or military associations are yet to be determined. It was even postulated by the original excavators that there could well be a villa here. No structures identified as a Roman villa as yet, but the material culture is quite high status. Lots of nice brooches, items of personal adornment, decorated Samian ware. You can see an illustration of on the screen. Corn dryers like you can see in the top image. At Satan Camp, I mentioned before, we're heading back towards Chester now. Again, a complex farm, agricultural base, so perhaps something that we really could call rural, a series of enclosures, so the field systems, some timber structures, possible stone-built structures, and again, the excavators have postulated that this would be an ideal villa location or villa kind of complex, but as yet, no signs of a Roman villa. So pre-2020, the only Roman villa that we've got in the hinterlands of Chester, across North Wales, and across pretty much all of Cheshire, as far as I'm aware, is Eaton by Tarporley, out to the east of Chester itself. Excavated by David Mason and soon coming into publication, I understand. A classic sort of Roman style building with Mediterranean features. So what we would call a villa. Mediterranean features being signs of hypercaust, so underfloor heating, painted wall plaster, stone-built construction, terracotta tiled roof, most likely, and potentially mosaic flooring. This seems quite odd to me. If we think about Chester, the fortress, it creates a protective landscape. It's there, it's a safe space for people signed up to everything that is Romano-British. The fertile landscape of the Cheshire Plain, but also of much of northeast Wales, is also ripe for agricultural production, whether it be corn, whether it be animal husbandry. The army also needs supplies, especially if we've got this big population overseeing all the industrial activity. So where then is everybody living? I'd like to just discuss the enigma of Poulton here as well. Mostly known for its lost Cistercian abbey that was founded between 1153 and 58, moved in, I think, 1214 to Leek in Staffordshire, and a subsequent Grange estate and abbey chapel was left sort of at Poulton. However, more recent excavations by the Poulton Research Project are really identifying what's a very exciting Iron Age settlement, but that later has quite substantial Roman activity on top of it, or later on, including a D-shaped enclosure, some Roman enclosure ditches, potential field enclosures, evidence of kilns, of burning of hearths, and rubbish dumping. So the material culture coming out of Roman phases at Poulton, again, to me would suggest you've got a high status settlement, potentially a villa, but as yet no Roman buildings have been identified. We're digging in the wrong place, is what initially you might respond. So there's got to be surely a population in this area that are working the land. They can't all be living in these industrial sort of roadside settlements. Equally, you'd expect with a population there to be rural shrines. We have these scattered across Britain, England and Wales. The only hints that we have so far of a rural shrine in the area is this rather lovely altar to Atropos, now in Gresford Church. Where it came from, we're not entirely sure. So the known, what I would class as rural, agricultural settlement is few and far between. The Roman Rural Settlement Project has identified a handful of these, but can you really categorise them as rural? They're not your regular Romano-British farmsteads. But the number of Roman finds and snippets of Roman material from northeast Wales and sort of the English border, to me, suggest much higher levels of activity than we sort of, the distribution of known sites would confer with. This is especially the case in Wrexham County Borough. So we've got this area here, which is sort of modern Wrexham, lots and lots of metal detecting finds that have been recorded on the Portable Antiquities scheme. This suggests much higher level of intensity within Roman activity in the area than is reflected with by those few number of known sites. So our current picture, associated with industry, exploitation, most sites seem to date from the Flavian period and later. They seem to have some kind of links with the Roman army, specifically the 20th Legion. And a lot of them also seem to be abandoned or turned over to civilian contractors in the early 2nd century. We don't have any known villas in northeast Wales. The only one that we can definitely say we've got nearby is at Eton by Tarporley. But there are hints that there's more going on in the area than we first thought. So this returns me to our site at Cobbler's Lane in Burton, where the lead pig was found. In October 2020, partial lockdown, we were unable to take some field work at that site, investigating the immediate area around where Rob Jones found that lead ingot. We did some geophysics of this site at Cobbler's Lane, But also remember I mentioned the site about 2 kilometres away that Steve and I were also interested in. This is a site just off Stringers Lane, also in Burton Green. With thanks to the Roman Research Trust, we had some money to go and do this initial phase of fieldwork. In Cobbler's Lane, after the geophysics didn't really show up any interesting anomalies at all, we positioned some trenches over what we thought could be interesting, as well as the spot where the pig itself was discovered. As you can see from these images, I think we spent the 2 weeks digging a swimming pool rather than anything specifically archaeological. Who would choose to dig in October in Wales? Not me again, that's for sure. I think I'd know by now, having spent a career in Welsh archaeology. And actually a rather underwhelming excavation didn't really reveal anything about the context of the pig itself. But in doing so, it raised questions about how it got there. Was it lost in transport, stolen or deposited nearby to collect later? It's heavy. It can't have been lifted very far from the road either way. So perhaps a small clue in the search to find these kind of routeways and trackways in this area. In the same month and into November, we also did some field walking and some geophysics at the Stringers Lane site. So the targeted field walking actually meant that we recovered over 25 kilograms of ceramic building material, or CBM, 70 sherds of abraded Roman pottery, fragments of painted wall plaster, and fragments of opus signinum, so crushed tile and lime mortar flooring used with kind of quite high status Roman buildings. All very indicative of a fancy structure, and no less than one would expect to find on any villa site in southern England. It was when we did the geophysics, though, that things really started to come together. As Chris, my colleague from Clwyd Paris Archaeological Trust, was processing the data on site, the outline of a Roman villa literally jumped out and slapped us in the face. In amongst all of these kind of black and white splodges, we can start to see, if you look at it long enough, you can start to see patterns in all of this. Specifically in this sort of bottom corner of one field. The main villa building, or domus, is sort of roughly situated or east-west, an east-west alignment. So nice south-facing aspect, or sort of south, just off south. Looking down towards the Pulford Brook, which is just at the edge of the survey plot at the bottom of the image there. You've got a rectangular structure that's come up quite clearly just in front of it, as well as some areas of possible burning or what had a high magnetic susceptibility in the magnetometry survey, including one that looks a bit like a reverse F shape you can see down towards the bottom right-hand corner, just above some red splodges. Also showing up some potential field boundaries, possible outbuildings and other features that you might expect in any sort of Romano-British farm, which is what a villa or a villa rustica in this sense would be. Obviously with geophysics, we don't get a clear idea of date for these things. So it was uncertain as to whether they were all chronologically contemporary or not. But this gave us enough to apply for funding for a season of intrusive fieldwork or excavations. So we move forward to summer 2021 with kind permission from the landowners, the Lewillis family who own and farm the land, support from Cadwyn Clwyd Rural Communities Fund, the Roman Research Trust, both University of Chester and Wrexham Museum. We began to start sticking some holes in it. We identified 4 initial areas we wanted to target: the villa, the domus itself, the house, the rectangular structure in front of it, the anomalies by the Pulford Brook, as you can see there with that sort of reverse F shape type anomaly, and a possible outbuilding in one of the fields. As we were opening the trenches, though, we had to reevaluate what was feasible to do within 3 weeks. I think we were rather over-optimistic. So we somewhat had to abandon Trench 4 for that season. Nonetheless, our aims really were to ground truth the geophysics, so test what the geophysics was showing us, evaluate the character and the condition of the buried archaeology, including the preservation, survival of artefacts and environmental evidence. And in doing so, we would then be able to inform further investigation, but also management of the site as well. So let's have a look at what was buried beneath the plough soil. And it literally was buried just beneath the plough soil. On our first day, machining off the topsoil, well, within about 6 minutes, I think it was, in fact, of sticking the big yellow trowel in the ground, we've got Roman masonry popping up, walls showing up. Not surprising, therefore, they were showing up on the magnetometry. They're so close to the surface, but also because they were using a lime mortar in the bonding. So that had a sort of a high magnetic susceptibility. So that's what made this structure light up like a Christmas tree. But the walls were in varying states of survival. One thing we were able to establish is quite how battered this villa has been by a combination of ploughing, so modern ploughing, but also of robbing in the post kind of villa or post-Roman period. So in best levels of survival that we've identified so far, about 1 or 2 courses of Roman masonry. In some places, you can see in the top right image there, all we've got left is the sort of the dust of the lime mortar that's kind of trickled out or been left behind. No foundations or anything. Some walls had even been robbed out completely, so they'd been the stone had been nicked at a later date, presumably to build other buildings in the area, because why go and quarry fresh stone when you've got a perfectly good supply here? Or potentially there's evidence that some were deliberately removed during the lifespan of the villa, but I'll return to that in a minute. So the trench had produced what we could pretty much see on the geophysics. So here we've got the sort of eastern end of the villa. In front of us, you've got a sort of a corridor, a wing, what we call a winged room, a corridor, and then the main range of the buildings to the left, or to the north, I should say, of the villa itself. Very much a winged corridor villa, is what we would call it. Inside the villa, so inside the building itself, we've got evidence for some flooring surviving, so on the top left image there, although for the most part it's been heavily disturbed or destroyed. Again, probably through ploughing. We have evidence for internal room dividers. So in the top right image, a partial wall and perhaps entranceway between 2 rooms. You can see. We've had some fragments of painted wall plaster. So we know that some of these rooms were decorated. And a range of pottery, of box flue tiles as well that would be used in a hypercourse system, so an underfloor heating system. The ceramics we've discovered range in a date from, I'd say, early 2nd century, probably at the earliest, although those are highly abraded. They look like they've been kicking around for quite a long time. All the way through to the 4th century with some Oxfordshire sort of hammerhead mortaria. We've also got 5 coins from this trench alone, all of which were identifiable to date from the 4th century. A bit like this one, a copper alloy nummus of the House of Constantine. The mint is unknown, but it dates from around AD 335 to 341. So very much in line with the types of coinage we'd expect to find in villas across Britain, thinking that the chronology of this fits in with our wider kind of patterns of villa settlement in Roman Britain. We were also able to start to see evidence for the reorganisation in the layout of the villa. So with one of the internal walls seemingly being deliberately dismantled sometime after AD 306 or 7. And this rare coin from the fill of the wall demolition cut suggests this. So we've got a coin of Constantine I as Caesar. This is one of my favourite pieces of evidence that we've got so far. Minted in London. And thanks to Lee Toon, a specialist in coins of the mint of Constantine, especially at London, he suggested that this was minted in the latter months of AD 307, more specifically probably November AD 307. What wonderful dating. That gives us a terminus post quem, or sort of earliest possible date for this wall to have been demolished or dismantled as well. So I really, really like that piece of evidence. So people are clearly living here and rearranging their space into the early 4th century. The final feature I'd like to show you in relation to the villa itself is located in the northeast corner. Identified initially by a rubble kind of spread once the topsoil was removed, we cleaned up around it, peeled back the top layer of the rubble, and were able to identify some regularity to the organisation of the stones. It appeared as though it might have been a drain or some sort of lined gully leading away from the villa to the eastern sort of external space, with the stones having an internal face to them, which is quite common in Roman drains. On further investigation, though, the lines of the stones went through into the building itself and appear to have had quite substantial sort of construction elements on the southern side. So if we just take a closer look, so the image on the left is looking eastwards, sort of away from the villa building itself, and the image on the right is in the middle of this feature, looking into, or what would have been, the villa building. Some small kind of exploratory sondages, as we call them, revealed that this was in fact a hypocaust flue. So running from a stoke, where Chris is standing in the right-hand picture, through into the villa, presumably beneath the floor level, so at foundation level, with the draw for the hypocaust leading eastwards, so where it would get its air from to help the fire burn, and also to sort of channel the hot air through into the building itself. The stoke and the section of the flue excavated showed signs of burning. So not only have we got a hypocaust, we know that it's been used, it's been fired. So the people that built this not only had the wealth to build a sort of a quite highly Romanized style building, they also had the wealth to use it, the means to use this. Just how far the heating system goes into the villa will be a question for future excavations. But we've managed to sample some of it and hopefully get some indication of what they've been burning, but also when they were burning it as well. Yep, so there it goes through into the building. It also interestingly looked like it had been deliberately decommissioned, with some of the walling to the south of it, so to the left-hand side of the image with Chris in, had been deliberately pushed into the stoke, decommissioning it. So we've got a rather nice, albeit somewhat denuded, winged corridor villa, which would have looked something a little bit like this. We're assuming it might have had 2 stories. There's a bit of artistic license in that, so you'll have to forgive us for that at this point. And this type of villa, this winged corridor villa, was very common throughout Roman Britain, although obviously not in Wales and northwest England. They're distinguished by their layout, so that front corridor or walkway with a range of rooms to the rear and 2 rooms at each end of the corridor, creating sort of wings or alae, as they would have been known. They vary in size and specific layout, as you can see in the examples here. Many in southern England developed into much larger, complex villas. So, for example, the top image here at Lullingston, this is the first phase at Lullingston Villa, which actually grows into what we'd call a palatial villa, a very, very high status, almost palace-like estate house. So for Roman Britain, they're not unheard of, they're quite normal, run-of-the-mill, but again, for this part of Roman Britain, they're virtually unheard of, Eton by Tarpley being the only other villa nearby. More recently, though, we found something that could suggest our villa is a little bit different, because Liverpool John Moores, working with David Jordan there, they were able to do some GPR for us, some ground penetrating radar, which has actually suggested on the western end, we've got a possible semicircular wall coming out from the western end of it, or an apsidal end. This is quite interesting. This could relate to a bathhouse, or it could be something different altogether. It's also, this is the recent satellite image that was available on the HER for Wales on Archaeology, which shows that potential apsidal end in the crop mark as well, which we hadn't previously identified. The other really annoying thing is that the GPR tells us that the part of the villa, the half of the villa that we haven't yet excavated, is probably the best preserved half. So while we've not done any damage to the villa, we know it's better preserved on that end. It would be really, really good in our next season of excavations to perhaps target that end and that potential apse on the eastern side, sorry, the western side. So other buildings within this kind of what we're assuming is a farming complex, a villa rustica and its associated farm. The kind of reverse F-shaped building or structures, anomalies towards the Pulford brick. You can see there on one image that's got lots of a grid of squares on it. There's quite a high intensity of blue on those squares. That's where the majority of the opus signinum fragments appeared in the field walking activity, so where the most flooring appeared. It sort of runs north-south down towards the Pulford brick. There's also evidence of sort of burning or high intensity, maybe industrial activity down there as well on the geophysics. So this was our contender for a bathhouse. We thought if we've got a bathhouse, this might be where you've got it. You've got a ready supply of water with the brick. We've also got this kind of burning showing up on the geophysics. Here we have walling of far more substantial than on the villa main building, the domus. Better construction as well, and better preservation. We've got in situ opus signinum flooring, and we've got phases of walling. So we've got, again, this idea of room dividers being added or taken away as well. I'll just show you this. So this is it from above, with the main walls outlined. So the surviving flooring is the patch between the walls, basically, where we've got this opus signinum still intact. It's leading off to the brick. The brick probably has moved a little bit over the last couple of millennia and has probably eaten away from this building. And it's obviously running back up towards the villa for some distance as well. So this is definitely a prime area to target for future work. Definitely no evidence to suggest that it's a bathhouse yet. However, Steve, my colleague, with his ever hopeful eye, would like to think that the wall peeking out from the bottom of the image, which he's highlighted with one of the dashed lines, he'd like to think it's curving somewhat. Although when you've only got 2 or 3 stones, I'm not entirely sure you could argue a solid case for that. But he'd like to think that that could be the sign of an apse, or that kind of half moon-shaped room that we would expect to have in a bathhouse. Finally, the other trench I wanted to discuss is this weird, or one over this weird sort of rectangular structure in front of the villa, because it's this that was an enigma at the start, no idea what it could have been, and it continues to be an enigma. So it was clear right from the start that whatever it wasn't very well built, and it was using materials taken from elsewhere on site. So it was probably post-villa construction in its date. Presumably, therefore, the villa, or at least part of it, its complex, was reduced in use or was out of use by this time. We excavated it in quadrants and were able to identify crude walling around the outside, although no clear bonding material, possibly just earth bonded, no clear flooring either, although there was a slightly sort of subterranean feel to it. Evidence of burning throughout the interior as well. suggesting destruction. So preserved charred timbers, bits of wattling, kind of spindles, perhaps evidence of walling or roofing that had sort of burnt and collapsed. We took some samples from that and have had that radiocarbon dated, and the C14 dates come back with a range between the 11th and 13th centuries. Some green glazed pottery in that layer would also sort of support that idea for that date for the sort of the demolition or destruction of this building. Other than that, it remains an enigma, as I mentioned. Further research is needed regarding the landscape at this time. Again, a similar date range of activity is at Poulton. However, which is situated just along the Poolford Brook towards the River Dee. So the connection between the site at Poulton and what's going on here are certainly areas for investigation. So we're getting a picture of a multi-period site, potentially a number of Roman phases, as well as sort of much later post-Roman activity as well. The artifacts for the Villa Domus suggest early 2nd century through to the 4th century activity. Then, of course, we've got reuse of the site in the sort of maybe 11th to 13th or maybe 14th centuries. Whatever happened between that time, however, remains uncertain. The artifacts from the site suggest that materials survive well, including metals, animal bone, plaster, as well as ceramic material. So the occupants of the villa were clearly connected to supply networks and integrated into the Roman economy, as one would expect from any villa estate. They've got regional ceramics, there's Holt wares, there's wares from the south coast, so black burnished wares from Dorset, Oxfordshire pottery, as well as access to the kilns at Holt with the Legio 20 stamp that interestingly was found reused in Trench 2 in that rectangular later building. There are artifacts that hint at the agricultural elements of the site, quernstone fragments for grinding grain, spindle whorls for the spinning of wool, but not much in terms of quantity or really in quality. Not a lot of personal adornment except for this beautiful top of a hairpin, which I love because hairpins in the Roman period were almost exclusively used by women. So that adds quite a nice dimension to the sort of our understanding of the occupants at this site. The plough damage, disturbance has taken its toll on the site. A lot of material has been extracted through metal detecting in the plough soil, but also we haven't yet found the rubbish dumps, we haven't found the middens. We're not going to find those in the domestic accommodation. So we need to start looking at the site more broadly in our excavations. Our engagement was really key. We wanted to make sure that we could involve as many people as possible, as logistically feasible. We had schools out on site, with thanks to Clwyd Paris Archaeological Trust for helping facilitate that. We made use of social media and, of course, created dig diaries, which are still available to view on the University of Chester website. And we want to continue to do this as future fieldwork continues. And none of it would have been possible without, of course, the local and student volunteers. We had a fantastic, enthusiastic team over 3 weeks and can never fully express our thanks to each of them for helping us work on this exciting discovery. So to summarise, what began with Rob Jones finding an extraordinary object bearing the name of Trebellius Maximus has triggered questions about our understanding of the conquest phases of North East Wales, as well as pre-Flavian extraction and processing of lead and silver by the Roman state. It's challenged our understanding of the road network in Roman North East Wales. It's alerted us to more extensive metal detecting finds and presumably Roman activity, and has led to the discovery of the most extraordinary thing, a villa rustica, in an area previously thought to have been dominated by military, industrial, and it was assumed, ephemeral rural roundhouse settlements. So by following it in Trebellius Maximus's footsteps and embarking on a larger scheme of survey and investigation, over the next few years, we hope to be able to identify more evidence for Roman activity in a landscape that would surely have been rich pickings, whether you were a farmer and made a living from the land or from the local mineral resources, or you were perhaps a retired soldier, settling down to enjoy your retirement within close proximity to the fortress. Thank you very much for listening. With thanks obviously to all our supporters and sponsors. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them, or at least try and answer them.